Take it away, Chad.
All right, sounds good. Let's okay. So a little bit about me. I'm really excited to talk to this group. I've been a CMO for early stage companies for most of my career. And so that means I've focused on kind of going from the earliest marketing efforts to a repeatable and scalable operation. I also teach graduate level venture capital at the University of Utah. And so after spending a lot of time focused on entrepreneurship, just last month, I launched a fractional CMO firm called CMO Zen. Excited about being able to serve more people in their marketing needs. And kind of the premise is that early stage companies need senior marketing help, but not always full time, and that having somebody senior available on demand allows them to set up marketing programs that then their more junior people who don't have that experience yet can successfully run. I've known Taylor for 10 or 12 years. And that said, I'm really embarrassed to say that I've only been attending Midday Connect for a month or so. He's had this thing going and I totally missed the boat. But it's been super, super fun for me to meet all of you. Some of you I've met enough to say hi and talk more about, and the rest of you I'm looking forward to being able to meet. So I'm also really flattered that Taylor would ask me to present to this group. I think this is a powerhouse group of really sharp people. And so I'm hopeful that there's some resources that I can share that will be useful. I'm going to go ahead and share the link to my slides in the chat. And in the, I'll have a page of links at the end of that with the resources that you can, and takeaways for everybody. So if you have to bail early or something, you can go ahead and grab that. For me, like I'm a big fan of frameworks. I kind of feel like frameworks are like kind of mini algorithms, meaning that they're collections of experience and wisdom and kind of pre-made decisions, and that make it faster and easier to get to sort of a best practices level. And then from there, it's we spend our time adapting to whatever the individual situation is. And so as I was thinking about, like, marketing is a huge topic, right? Like there's a bajillion frameworks. And so what I thought I would share today is a couple of examples around pricing. So I hope there's a few takeaways here that you haven't seen before, and some things that you'll find that are useful. So that said, right, who's ready to talk a little pricing voodoo? And like, why do I say voodoo? Here's an example. Here's two examples. One is the ugly cat story from Harry Beckwith's Selling the Invisible. I have an ebook, a link to the ebook for that I'll share with you in the resources. He tells a story about a lady in Denver, and she's got this litter of kittens she's trying to sell. And she's advertising, she's dropping the price. Ultimately, she's like putting ads out, trying to get rid of these cats for free, and nobody is buying. So finally, in desperation, she posts like, okay, ugly cats, $100, and they're gone in an afternoon. And so you get stories like that. And the other one is from Robert Cialdini's Influence, where he tells a story about a jeweler in Mesa that is selling Native American jewelry. And the shopkeeper goes on vacation, leaves a note for their assistant saying, hey, all this stuff needs to go, mark it down half price while I'm gone. The assistant mistakenly reads that and doubles the price of everything. And the shopkeeper comes back and is surprised to see that everything is sold. And so these kind of counterintuitive examples of pricing, well, I mean, like marketing is easy, right? It's no price, you just show up and people, so these counterintuitive examples make it to where it's hard to believe that there's a more data-driven approach. So I'm going to try to convince you that using whatever data you can be to inform marketing decisions, and particularly about pricing, will be helpful. So to do that, I'm going to start with an example. I use this with my students every semester. This is a pretty well-known story. If you know it, you know the punchline. If you don't, hopefully this will be a fun takeaway for you. So imagine that you're the owner of a world-famous pizzeria, right? You got amazing pizza, and you got these cheesy breadsticks that are to die for, but you're not sure that you're pricing your product in a way that maximizes your revenue. So you do a little bit of marketing research, and you determine that there are four different groups, four segments of customers that you have, and they're segmented based on their preferences. So I realize I'm committing a presentation faux pas by putting a spreadsheet on a slide. Forgive me, this isn't the last one I have either. I'm sorry about that. But here you've got these 4 segments, right? A, B, C, and D. Segment A, and there's 100 customers of each that show up to your shop every month. Segment A is like really into pizza, not so much in breadsticks. Segment D is the almost exact opposite, really into breadsticks, not so much into pizza. And B and C are kind of in the middle. And so I give this as a problem to my students, like, okay, how do you extract the most revenue from this audience that's coming to your shop? And usually they start like this. It's like, well, okay, I can capture half the market by pricing pizza at $8, because the people who are willing to pay $9, they will also pay $8. And with breadsticks, I can also capture the other half. So now if I price my breadsticks at $8.50 and my pizza at $8, I can get all 400 people that come into my store to buy something. And so that's pretty cool, right? That means I'm generating $3,300 in revenue every month on pizza and breadsticks by pricing them individually based on willingness to pay. So then I think about it, it's like, okay, is there anything else that you could do to try to extract more revenue from this? And one of the thoughts is, well, what if we bundled them? What if we took and we added the willingness to pay together for each segment? And so here's a column showing the bundled price, and $10.50 in this example is the lowest price. Everybody would buy both at $10.50. Well, that's great. Now, instead of just buying one product, people are buying 2, and my sales go up, right? From I have all 400 people paying $10.50. So I just went from 3,300 to 4,200, 27% higher than pricing individually just by bundling. That is like some pricing voodoo right there. Did I generate any more leads? No, 0 more leads. Exact same number of leads. Did I change my product, enhance my product to appeal to a different group? No, everything there is exactly the same. The only thing I did was adjust my structure to match willingness to pay better. WTP is willingness to pay, if I forgot to say that. So this shows me individual versus bundled. What if I was to do both? This is called mixed bundling. So let's say that I take the people who are willing to pay individually high, and then I take the people who are willing to pay bundled high, and I price my product like that. You can buy either pizza or breadsticks for $9, or you can get both for 13. In this example, I can extract another $200 again, just by structure, just by knowing that that bundling or mixed bundling is an option. And in my class, right, so I've probably presented this to maybe 500 students. And one time has somebody come back to me and said, oh yeah, this is exactly how we do it. And it was a student who worked at Hogle Zoo. Almost there, most people start or stop at $3,300 and don't see that. So again, just structure, right? Didn't change anything else, got me 33% more revenue. That's a little pricing voodoo. Now, that's all well and good, right? So nice, Chad, but how do you discover willingness to pay? And this is kind of a white whale, like this is tricky. So I'm gonna show you one method, and we could talk about others with more time. But I'm gonna talk to you about the Van Westendorp story. So Van Westendorp was a Dutch market researcher, and he came up with this approach in the 70s. If any of you have taken my little survey about, what would you be willing to pay for CMO services, you'll recognize these questions. Now, I'm not the first guy to talk about Van Westendorp. So these are 3 really prominent pricing gurus. Nick Kalenda has a great website, and I'll share links to all of their resources before we're done. Madhavan Ramunijam is the author of Monetizing Innovation. He's also the formulator of the pizza and breadsticks example. And then Patrick Campbell has a website called Price Intelligently. And all of these guys share versions of the Van Westendorp. Okay, so what's Van Westendorp other than a funny Dutch name? Well, it's these 4 questions. Okay, the first question is, what price is way too expensive? You'd never consider purchasing. The second one, this is probably the most important one, is which price is getting expensive, but you would still consider it. The third one is what price is a great deal? You'd buy that right now. And the fourth one is what price is too cheap? You start to doubt the quality of what you're getting. Now, before I show you some examples, there's limitations to the Van Westendorp survey. Some of them are, people might think that their answers influence the price, so they may have a bias to give you low answers. Some people may not believe there's any price that's too cheap, so all their too cheap answers are zeros. You may have peaks and valleys in the distribution of your respondents. So maybe there's a lot of variation in willingness to pay, And so that said, still, every time I've run a Van Westendorp, it has been, it's provided insight, directional insight. And I think that's important too, to know that this isn't it's not a Bible for determining your price. It's just a way to collect a really valuable input in terms of decision-making around price. So when you plot the responses to those questions, each of those 4 questions is represented by a line, and you kind of get this little diamond shape here that represents a band of willingness to pay based on these respondents. And so that gives you a lot of, and there's more sophistication where you can say, okay, this is like the point of ambivalence or whatever. But what I find is like, look, okay, how does this relate to what I'm charging now? Is what I'm charging now, does it fall within this band, or is it something totally different? And does this data help inform our decision? So I grabbed a case study from when I was the CMO at GoReact. We ran one of these, and I'll show you what our results looked like. So this was the problem what we were facing. GoReact sells a video coaching tool into higher education, and it was priced at $19 per student per semester. And this was in 2018, so it's almost 4 years ago. We hadn't changed our pricing in 2 years, right? So in SaaS years, that's like a lifetime. But we were getting indications from our sales team that the willingness to pay for a product might be higher. Like people were surprised that our price was so low. And we couldn't tell if these were just anecdotes or if there was actually a trend there. So we decided to run a survey and see if we should raise our prices or not. This is what our Van Westendorp is, not as pretty as the default example, right? Like this is a pretty funky example. But what it did tell us right off the bat is down here, we were priced at 19 bucks. So we're down here close to this $20 mark. And this zone of willingness to pay is definitely higher than where we were at. The chart itself was a little difficult for us to follow. And maybe we didn't have as many respondents as we could have had or whatnot. But that didn't mean that the survey was invaluable. We took a look at some of the data, and here's some things that popped out to us, right? So right away, we're seeing that we're looking down this column 3, right? And all of a sudden there's a big jumps at certain price points. So I charted those over here by percentage increase. And so here you can see the bands, and they're all on the $5 marks. We're like, okay, so people are conceptualizing their price for our product in $5 increments. And then we can look and say, okay, what's the magnitude of these? The biggest one is up here at 30 bucks. So at $29, right, we would have still 71% of the inverse of this, right? 71% of those respondents would still be willing to pay if we charged $29. So essentially, right, at $29, we would stand to lose roughly 30% of our customers. And that's if they were 100% on point about their willingness to pay. But we would gain almost 50% in revenue going from $19 to $29. And so that makes it, gives us some data around, and ultimately that's what we did at GoReact, was we went to $29.99, and we had some churn, but it was smaller than 30% and manageable, informed by running the Van Westendorp. Another analysis that we did real quick, and this is mostly for you to take a look at in the spreadsheet that I will link to, is, so if we take a look at the total number of respondents, so in this case we had almost 70 respondents, and we see how many of them are still willing to pay at each price point. And then we calculate how much revenue that is. Then that shows us a point at which that's the maximum revenue of any of these respondents, where the number of people who churn out is not greater than the increase of revenue that we get from raising the price. So that said, that's the end of my presentation, but I'll walk you through those resources real quick. So here's a link to my survey if you're interested at all in fractional CMO services. This is a great place to start. This link here on the Van Westendorp spreadsheet will take you to a Google Sheet that you can then just copy, just make your own copy, and you'll have access to all the analysis. You could plug in your own survey respondents and run a Van Westendorp yourself. And then these resources are all external. So Nick Kalenda's website, there's free pricing psychology resources. He has a pricing course that's about $200. For me, I think that's still a really good value because it's worth more than if I was doing that much Googling myself. And he walks step by step calculating the Van Westendorp. This one, Harry Beckwith, this is a free copy of his book, Selling the Invisible. And then here's Madhavan Ramunajam's Pizza and Breadsticks, a link to his book, Monetizing Innovation. And then also, if you just want the cliff notes for that, he did an article with First Round that's here. Also, there's a First Round article with Patrick Campbell, and then some resources from Robert Cialdini. So, all right.
Chad, that's awesome. That was an amazing presentation. I geek out a little bit, so I'm happy that on data. So I'm happy that you put some spreadsheets in the presentation. So thank you for that. I'd love to get questions rolling from the group. So start thinking about questions. You can throw them in the chat, but also just of note, typically I will tell our presenters, like we created this group to not be a selling group, more of an education and networking group. And so I'm going to try and stick to that framework, but I will say that I'm a happy customer of CMO Zen. Just saying. So that's my endorsement. Okay, we've got some questions coming in, Chad, in the chat. And then also just feel free to unmute yourself and let's have a great discussion.
Yeah, great. Okay, so Karthik, I see you had a question about price change. So I have an ebook that I'm working on for the new year that has a section about price changes. But so a couple of things that work well, I think. I think it works well if you're growing. It works well to grandfather people at old pricing because that segment becomes so small in terms of your overall customer base that it's kind of meaningless. And so we were careful about selecting who we grandfathered. The other thing was that we tried to communicate about the price changes were coming as far in advance as we could. At GoReact, we sold into higher ed, so our big customer acquisition spikes happened at the beginning of the semester, so like September and January. So most adjustments that we had would affect people on a semester by semester basis. If we were doing something that was more sort of ongoing, then I think the biggest thing is don't hide things. Make it really transparent to people what's happening. So that's sort of it to your comment about all-in-one, like just rip the Band-Aid off.
That's great. That's really helpful, Chad. Nathan, you've got your hand up. You want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, so I was looking at the data a little bit there, and I love the spreadsheets too. I'm a data guy. My question is, first off, I'd love to see kind of a sample of the research or the questionnaire you asked and how you asked those questions to avoid bias. And the second part of that is, if you're a startup and you're trying to get market penetration, at what point in time do you say, okay, I know I can charge this, but maybe I go down a little bit to get more penetration, to get more people on board so that I can raise my prices later and maybe get some, the flywheel going a little quicker?
Yeah, that's great. So having run this type of two questions, right? One was about structuring your questions so you avoid bias. So typically I structure them pretty close to the way that I put them in the slides. But I think you should be sensitive to that, right? I've run them with minor changes in wording and haven't seen a lot of impact. I think also the bigger sample size is, the less that matters.
Of note, Chad, just of note there, and for Nathan, if you click on that link in his last slide, you can see a survey that he would benefit from you taking. So go take that survey.
Take my survey, you'll see how I was asking them to people like Taylor. And then the other question I believe you had was about the number of respondents, and was that right, Nathan?
Not number of respondents, but if you're a startup and you're looking for penetration in the market, right? At what point in time do you sacrifice, $2 or $3 in excess or in this marginal price versus getting more customers on board to kind of get the flywheel going and more customers and things like that?
Yeah, so I think what that gets at is essentially there's really only three pricing strategies. There's skimming, penetration, or value maximization pricing. And they each have different goals. So the real question is, are you clear about what your goal is? And does your goal align with your pricing strategy? So I don't think there's a one size fits all answer to, should you use a skimming approach, or should you use like luxury goods almost all use skimming, which is trying to maximize the most profit out of each transaction, but not about volume. Or versus penetration, like freemium is really kind of the ultimate penetration price. Right? We just want as many users as we can get, and we're going to monetize a certain percentage of those later. And I think most like B2B SaaS scenarios are looking for value maximization, which is where's that delta in supply and demand where we have the profit maximizing price. For what in this form, I think that's probably as detailed as we could go. Happy to talk more about it.
No, that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, Chad, we've got a couple in the chat from Jeff Erickson, starting there, I think is the last one. And Jeff, if you want to unmute yourself, feel free.
Yeah, I was just wondering, what's the number of responses you're getting in these surveys? Is 100 too little? Is 1,000 too much? What's kind of the sweet spot there, and what have you found?
Yeah, so I would love to have always 200 responses at a minimum, but really often then you'd be like in the territory of statistical significance and kind of unimpeachable data. But at GoReact, we had about 170 responses. And then once we pared down all of those that were, am I frozen?
No.
Okay. Once we pared those down, like where there was no delta in their willingness to pay, the survey that I just showed on screen had 69 total responses, and that was enough to show the trends. I think you could probably see trends in as little as 30. You you have risk with a small sample size.
Cool, that's helpful. Parker, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, sure. And you may have kind of answered this because you're sending out surveys to people here, for example. But like comparing getting survey data from people who are already using your product versus potential customers, is one more valuable than the other, or does it work just as well? Like if we're trying to sell something but we have no customers, can we just be reaching out to who we think we're selling to and get a strong willingness to pay?
Yeah, so if your product if you already have a customer base, then at least you have an audience who understands what they value out of your product, right? Like if it's a new product introduction, then sometimes you have a hurdle in terms of educating them, helping them understand the value. I'm doing that with a client right now where we have a product and we're running willingness to pay surveys, but we're running them to prospects, so they don't have deep experience. And so in that case, we're doing a little bit of extra education. We start the survey with a video about the product, so at least we're getting their imagination around the value of what they think they would pay. And so it's a consideration, right? Is this new product introduction, new product, new market, new product, old market, a new line extension in old market, that type of thing.
Thanks.
Super cool. Brandon, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, guys. Yeah, my question is, this model seems really straightforward where deliverables are very similar, and the cost of those deliverables, whether that's pizza or SaaS software, is the same. They're kind of holding steady the service and saying broadly, what will you market pay for this? So is this model applicable in a setting where you have custom deliverables where on the back end? So for example, at my business, we did custom branding projects and custom website builds. And so the time required to deliver these services varied widely. So how can you kind of trim down and find that key pricing zone where on your side it's so variable and what the customer's receiving is so variable?
Yeah, that's a great example. And for sure, like frameworks always are like the simplest of all possible worlds, right? Everything's tidy, everything, all the numbers add up. I think I think one of the ways I would approach something like that is to understand what the unit of sale is. So as you're building a custom, custom delivered service, it was cutting in and out a little bit, so I'm not sure I got exactly what your example
My
was.
apologies.
But if I'm delivering something, it's custom every time, right? So it's going to be variable. What's the unit of sale and what's the unit of value? So for the buyer, what is it that they feel like that they're paying for? And I think that you could probably then distill that into something that you could use some frameworks for. Also, if you're doing super custom work, you may not need to survey a broad swath of customers. Your interactions with customers might be more intimate, and you can understand them even more closely. Like, for example, let's say I have a very expensive custom service that I deliver, but I only deliver it to 5 or 10 or even 25 or 30 customers in a year. I can know each of those customers. I don't need to genericize them to understand, that. And so that I think that's probably my best answer on that one. This is a great question.
Awesome. Thanks, Chad.
Another question from Karthik on how customers are funded and how that impacts willingness to pay. Karthik, do you want to share any additional background on the question?
Yeah, Chad, your previous customers were higher education, right? You weren't selling directly to the professors who have like grants that they're written, but I imagine that if you're selling a product that's bought by people who are using either grants or venture money, maybe, then that affects willingness to pay. I don't know, what have you seen? How does that change? How does WTP change based on type of funding?
If I understand right, the essence of your question is around if there's a disconnect between who I'm selling to and who pays. Is that like would you bridge the gap? Or is it just about, because ultimately the idea of willingness to pay is that it boils down to somebody makes a decision. So somebody has to decide, yes, that's within my appetite to get whatever I'm going to get from this product or service. And so if you drill down into the psychology of it, there's a person there, a human being somewhere that's making a decision. And that's really what we're trying to understand. Like, willingness to pay is really just a more colloquial way of talking about demand in terms of supply and demand. And so if there's demand for something, then the tools for measuring willingness to pay are trying to get at and quantify demand. I don't know that I answered your question. Is there more? Do you want to ask a follow-up there, Karthik?
I think I understand that you don't need to care about how they're getting their funding to get this answer, because it's at the end of the day, your customer is one person. It doesn't matter how they're funded.
Yeah,
right.
I mean, one way to look at that too might be, it's like, let's say that what I was selling was shares of my company to a VC. Well, it does matter where the VC gets their money, right? Their money is often not, or at least not by and large coming from themselves, but they have a bunch of LPs and they have a charter for how they can invest that money. And so understanding those mechanisms that are at work, that's a much different psychology than, say, an e-commerce thing or an emotional, you put something on the power aisle at the grocery store. And usually B2B is more considered, it's less emotional, and understanding what the rules are, what it's like, okay, we can only invest, say, a certain percentage of our portfolio. So if you're asking for more money than that, it's a no. Like, our willingness to pay doesn't extend to that level. I don't know if that's a good example or not, but it's what I could come up with at the moment.
Makes sense.
Got another question from Nancy on survey groups versus focus groups. When do you move from a survey to a focus group?
That's a great question. So one of the reasons that I talk about surveys usually first is because it has to do with cost. What's the volume of response that I can get for the lowest cost? And sometimes surveys, like I've run a bunch of surveys where they're incentivized. So like, hey, if you take this survey, we'll give you a like a $25 Amazon gift card or something like this. And so it can be more expensive to run a focus group. And I think also if you're with a focus group, you bring people and you're going to try to extract as much information as you can from them about all types of things. So not just willingness to pay, but features that they value and other things. So I think the first benchmark I would use is cost. How much are we willing to spend to get this done, and how accessible is it? Like, for example, I may have a junior marketing ops guy that can send a survey, and it may take a lot more expertise for me to successfully run a focus group. But I don't think there's anything about surveys or focus groups that is mutually exclusive. I think, nor do those represent the entire universe of customer data that is useful and valuable. So I think that's a great question.
I think you answered Parker's incentivizing question as well. How do you incentivize people to take surveys? So that's helpful.
And in terms of the rules, I would say we try to do the least expensive possible. So if people usually I always, let's say I have 1,000 people that on a list that I could potentially survey. I usually want to survey a small segment first to give me an idea of what the response rate is. Do I need to incentivize to get a better response rate? Is there something, did I write my questions wrong and people are just misunderstanding what I'm asking? And then once you kind of drill it down, then send to the rest of the group.
Question.
Go ahead.
So Chad, you talked all about pricing, but with all the companies that you've helped or worked with, is there something in particular that generally is preventing them from moving to the next level, or is it just really varied across the board? Like, is it pricing? Is it the distribution channels they're going after, or is it just totally different by company?
Well, I think that as companies evolve, they get smarter about each of the sort of planks in their business, right? So in the beginning, right, maybe it's a solo founder, maybe it's a small team, and they're doing everything. And like I've talked to Taylor about this, I talked about this with my team. In the beginning, you just need no holes, right? You need the basics of your business to be at a level of sufficiency where they're functional. And a lot of times what that means is that by the time people are having doubts about their pricing, they priced based on intuition, and the biggest feedback they got was, did people buy? And that might be sufficient for the first period of the company's growth. But I think then the question becomes, it's like, okay, when we kind of have a basic functional operation, and now we want to look at what are impediments to scale, knowing whether your pricing is just from the hip or whether you have a data-driven approach to it becomes smart, along with a bunch of the other components to both marketing and how you manage the business. Does that answer your question? Because you kind of you kind of do what you got to do to get the company going, and then it's like an economy, right? You hire more people, and you have a specialization of labor that happens, and you start to have people that can focus more on individual areas of the business. And a lot of times that opens up an opportunity to say, hey, anybody tracking the fact that our salespeople are getting these kind of comments about price all the time? And do we think we should reevaluate or make a change, or maybe we're ready to launch a new product because we think that new product is going to open up a new market segment to us. But do we have the time to stop and think, hey, maybe we should be smart about pricing before we turn this thing loose?
Yeah. Okay.
Did we touch on your question, Karthik, on how often to reevaluate pricing? Chad, can you comment on that?
Sure. I think that's a very subjective thing, right? At GoReact, it was a long time to go 2 years without reevaluating pricing. It doesn't mean that the pricing has to change every time we reevaluate it, but we want to do a check-in, or if there's evidence that our pricing might be off. Certainly there's other industries where you have, I think e-commerce is a good example, right? You could have dynamic pricing that is changing minute to minute. And so I think exactly what your segment is informs a lot about how often you should come back and revisit it. Another thing could be like how, when does it percolate to the top as the low hanging fruit in terms of if I spend time and energy on this, this will move the needle the most for me.
Sean, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much, Chad. It's an awesome presentation. I have a question around if you're just starting out and you don't have any data to suggest what your pricing points should be, where you should start. And in our example, it's a SaaS model. But if that's applicable, can you chat about kind of how do you start rather than this type of a strategy is that's not a good pricing strategy. So any suggestions on how we should start exploring pricing with no data?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Certainly, if you are in a market that is where the segment that you're targeting has competitors that are fairly similar to you, you can borrow, like that's a data point you borrow. I think if I was starting from scratch, I'd go through an exercise of understanding what my strategy was going to be, like what Nathan asked earlier about, right? Is your strategy about penetration or skimming or value maximization? Assuming that you have a value maximization strategy, which is really common for SaaS companies, then you start going through the list. And what you kind of want to do is, if you have like zero data, right? Early on, you want to start building your list of potential customers. And so that gives you a place to go for data. But you're right? Day one, it's like, I don't know. So what do you do? I think the only thing you can do is go through the exercise about using your best judgment about what you think is right, and then you test it with the customer. You go out, like, is it worth sacrificing this next sales call to see if somebody's going to respond, if my price seems, out of sight or within reason?
Cool, thank you.
Any other
That's a great
questions
question, Sean.
before we wrap things up? Okay, Chad, this has been awesome. I love listening to people talk who know what they're talking about. It's awesome. So thank you very much. This has been really helpful.
Thanks, you guys. Super fun. And thank you, Taylor. That was a real privilege to be in front of this group. This is a great group.
Thanks, Chad. Just letting everybody know, I'll post about this as well. The next 2 weeks are bye weeks for Midday Connect. So we won't have presentations, but we'll kick things off first week of the new year in January. So I will keep posting on some stuff over the next couple of weeks, but we won't have a meeting next Tuesday or the following. So thanks, everybody, and look forward to seeing you next year.
Yeah, happy holidays, everybody. And if you happen to be in the north, we have Jeff Erickson at the Silicon Slopes Farmington for lunch on the 22nd. So I just want to put that out there. It's going to be fun and a great group. So
I did see that. That looks like a fun event.
worth a drive to Farmington.
Cool.
See you there, Nancy.